Hello, my name is Tyler Ussery. I use the pronouns he, him, his, and this is the Neuroscience of Mental Health. I do want to give a quick disclaimer that I will be talking briefly about self-harm and suicide. So if these are disturbing or triggering for you, please use caution and self-care as necessary, and please feel free to reach out should you need any more details or be provided with any resources to help you deal with anything that arises as a result of this talk. First, I do want to talk about the breakdown of the talk. There you go. So we have 5 sections. We have the introduction, and we're going to talk about the brain and neurophysiology. We're going to talk about psychopathology, which is essentially where the brain can go different or wrong. And a lot of people refer to this as neurodivergence in recent popularity. Next, we'll talk about designing a mental health routine for an individual. And then I will discuss some resources, and of course there will be a Q&A, which can be addressed in the formats which is appropriate for source. Of course, this won't be live, but okay, so moving on. This is an introduction. This is me. There are a lot of pictures of me up here. This is not to be selfish. This is to draw attention to the fact that after each and every one of these pictures, I had a severe depressive breakdown as a result of severe anxiety. Depression and anxiety are largely understood among the general public. And I want to bring awareness to what mental health is. And that essentially brings us to our first question. What does mental health really mean? Is it a physically healthy brain? Is it the absence of mental illness? Is it the ability to cope with undesirable life experience, a state of being, a mindset, and so on? There is not necessarily an indication of being mentally healthy in either one of these people. I did a search for mental health, and these pictures were among what showed up, which is interesting, given that there's no indication of being mentally healthy or not mentally healthy. Which of these individuals is or is not mentally healthy? You can't tell. Does the facial expression that they give and they elicit, does that tell you the status of their mental health? Not in the slightest. I want to point attention to that in the next slide as well. There are several people you see here. You may recognize them as performers, actors, singers, athletes, politicians, and such. Really pay attention to your reaction to them. What do you think about? You probably think about what you recognize them in. However, there's one thing that unites each and every one of these individuals. Each and every one of these people has talked about on a public scale mental health, and each one of them has been scrutinized for it. This is where some of the stigma of mental health arises and is something to be talked about. It's just misunderstood. It's not necessarily neglect. It's not necessarily a harmful thing. It's just something to be talked about. It is harmful in some cases, but is not guaranteed to be harmful if you talk about it in a certain way. The major thing we need to move towards is an understanding of what mental health is. That's a really challenging question, as we saw in the previous slide, which brings us to our next point of it's not easy to tell what mental health is. It's easier to ask the question of what it is not. So mental health is not visibly consistent. It is also not a universally transferable experience or a process, and it is most certainly not the absence of a mental illness. So if you don't have mental illness, that does not make you mentally healthy. And again, the absence of a mental illness or an identifiable mental illness does not mean that you will be guaranteed to be mentally healthy. This is a point that's really worth driving home. I want to move into the next section where we talk about brain stuff. These are essentially everything, is not necessarily everything, but just a lot of associations with brain areas, which is on the left, and then neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, on the right. These are all associated with mental health, of course. Before you get too wild in looking at the details of this, don't necessarily read the slides, but we're going to look at brain areas and neurotransmitters. There's a huge difference here. So these are a specific location in the brain. So you can point to where the basal ganglia is. You can point to the amygdala. You can point to where dopamine and serotonin are made, but they exist throughout the nervous system. And with some of these neurotransmitters, they exist in the bloodstream as well. The main thing I want to bring about here is let's take a look for a second at the amygdala, which is primarily responsible for stress response, memory, pleasure, anger, and a host of other things. Where a dysfunction in the amygdala can bring about anxiety, panic disorder, PTSD, bipolar disorder, depression, and so on. What is most important to know here is that anxiety appears on many of the dysfunctional correlate side of these things. Again, with depression, many individuals will say, oh, well, it seems as though everyone's anxious and depressed these days. Well, that might actually be the case. We're not just over over emoting these things, these might actually be problems that people are having with all of these things as a result of a largely artificial world. A lot of things we eat and do are not natural for the human progression of life. So these may be affecting us. So each brain area develops over time, which brings us to our next slide. The brain develops over the course of the lifetime, but is almost entirely developed in terms of its physical characteristics at 5 years old. At 5 years old, we are capable of doing and learning anything. That's basically where that's a blank slate for us. We can do anything. We're capable of doing many things, but connecting the dots is where it gets harder. So you start really building the skills in these critical periods of your life. You're born with the ability to do things like blink, eat, move, but the ability to control those comes afterwards. And the development cycle is where a lot of this happens. I do want to point attention to reaching full size at 11 to 14 years. This is essentially the start of puberty for many people, or a couple years into puberty for a few individuals. And this is largely indicative of some of the challenges that we face. Even though we get to full size, there's still a lot of development that takes place in terms of experience and the way that we navigate the growth process during the middle and especially the end of puberty. So we get to our maximum processing capability at 18 years old. That's the max. You can't really get too much after that. You pretty much max out there, but you have a whole life ahead of you. So what we really want to point to here is the fact that over the course of your life, you're able to learn and unlearn several processes. So if you're not using something, you're going to lose it. So if you are, let's say you're doing math at 30, you stop doing math for 15 years. At 45, you try to pick up math again. You'll get there. It'll probably come up, but it'll be a lot longer as if you never stopped. So just food for thought in terms of mental health, it works a lot in the similar ways. And psychopathology. So if you want to talk about anxiety, depression again, these are generally understood things in science. There's still a lot of things we need to understand about the neuroscience of anxiety and depression, but we do know a lot about. They're really complicated. These are really complicated things. We really understand things like eating disorders. So these are basically, a better term would be maladaptive eating behavior. So essentially, there's some dysfunction in the ability to regulate reward and cognitive control surrounding eating and not eating. And this is, there are specific regions of the brains that are responsible for this. But this is not necessarily due to trauma. It could be a genetic predisposition to have some sort of problem with the limbic system or the ventral frontal striatum, or any combination of these. It's not exactly clear what causes or stops this process, but the process happens nonetheless. We know how the process happens in certain individuals based on their history. Anyways, I want to take a second and talk about self-harm and suicide. Essentially, what's happening with self-harm and suicide, there's the inability to regulate a thought. And this is not comprehensive for all cases, but what happens a lot of time with self-harm, individuals who do practice self-harm, of course, this is not something we want to do in most cases. This is not something that we desire to do, but the thought of doing it is there, and there's an inability to stop that thought. And when that thought is constant for long enough, it's so easy to give into that, because there's literally, from a neuroscientific perspective, there is not the control that you need to stop yourself from doing these things. It's not a willful thing. It's not a thing for attention. It can be in seldom cases, but that's not usually the case. The same thing with suicide. These are not entirely understood things, but we do know enough to know, okay, a lot of these problems can be fixed by at least talking about it. The experience of understanding and talking about each of these various ailments is worth doing. We need to talk about it in the future of mental health. Here's a bit of a model, if I were to describe it that way, basically where mental health is a goal. It's not necessarily easy to define, but it's a goal. I want to be mentally healthy. I get these in check, and then I'm held back by a physical or mental illness. And essentially, it's not that easy to get from your goal, to go from where you're at to your goal, but you need to be able to remove those roadblocks along the way, if that makes sense. Essentially, you want to make sure you get age-appropriate sleep, have a correct diet, eat your veggies, your fruits, your whole grains, etc. You want to exercise both your body and your mind, have a good social life, and being able to identify what that means for you, and then identify and dealing with the roadblocks as they arise. With that, I wanted to go on to the next slide, show you some important statistics. Feel free to pause here and check them out in your own time. But essentially what we need to do is talk